Okay, hello everybody. It is Wednesday, April 15th. I hope you had a great Easter break. Got a little bit of time to catch up there. And are coming back refreshed for the rest of this week. So this week, we don't have a workshop. You can see that in the syllabus, but because we don't have Monday, we just have Wednesday and Friday. We're not having a workshop. Instead, we're just talking about endangered species management today and on Friday. And so, let's see, I had a couple other updates I wanted to give you. Oh, I saw a lot of people had trouble with the workshop 7 that we did last week with the California condor recovery. People had trouble with the Excel sheet. And that was mainly because for people who have Google Chrome, you can't use Microsoft Office applications. And some other people just found the directions hard to follow. So I responded to everybody at this point, and I saw that 20 out of the 24 of you have handed it in. So I hope to get to grading those soon, but just know that if you have Google Chrome and you couldn't do it and you communicated with me about that, I do understand these limitations and I will take them into account. Also remember that you drop one workshop, right? You drop a workshop. Out of your 9 workshops, 1 gets dropped and doesn't count. So if you have anything else you want to share about that workshop, just send me an email and we can talk about it. But yeah, I just wanted to give that little update on it. So again, today we are going to be talking about endangered species management. So I have this first slide that I always have. Today you're just going to watch this video of me lecturing, and then you're going to take the mini assessment that's up there. There's no additional video. And part of the reason that there's no additional video is because last week we worked on a closely related topic, extinction. And so first we covered extinction. What is extinction? How can it happen? And now I put this Monday, but it's this Wednesday. Now we're going to talk this Wednesday about how to prevent extinction. But you already kind of worked on that last week in your workshop. So there's the California condor. It's another picture of that beautiful and enormous bird that you did your workshop on how to prevent that species from going extinct. So a lot of the concepts in that workshop you will also hear about today, because we're talking about how to plan for endangered species, how to manage them so that they don't go extinct. So let's look at what is the goal overall of endangered species management. So we know that it is overall to prevent extinction, obviously, right? But it also has other goals. We want to preserve biodiversity, right? So not just the species itself, but the role that it plays in the ecosystem, maintain ecosystem stability and function, right? So we'll touch on that again later on, but if you lose a species, you don't just lose that species, you change the way in which other species that related to that extinct species now relate to their environment, right? And the last goal there is to recover small populations. Small populations are not good, and we'll go through some reasons why later in this lecture. And then this is kind of a sad way to start, but I just wanted to show you some examples. These are species that went extinct in 2019. That's the Sumatran rhino up there. It's now extinct. That's a Chinese freshwater soft-shell turtle, now extinct. And the cheetahs are not extinct in Africa, but they were declared extinct last year in India. There was an Indian cheetah, and they went extinct because of desertification. So too much farming and ranching on lands that can't withstand it led to desertification, and now that species is extinct, or that subspecies. So this is happening now. Okay, so what are the legal protections for endangered species? Because if you're going to talk about making a recovery plan like the California condor recovery plan, you're not going to be able to make a good recovery plan that you can actually implement unless you have legal support and financial support, right? So what is the legal support for these types of plans and actions? Hopefully you're familiar with the United States Endangered Species Act. It's behind my head here, but this act was passed in 1973, and with the idea that we need to protect species, but also subspecies like that Indian cheetah, and population segments, so important population segments. And why would you protect just a population segment? Because you might have a population segment that has much higher genetic diversity than other populations, and so you want to preserve it for the future of the species, or is in a particularly threatened habitat area, so you need to put extra resources into it. There's all kinds of reasons. And then we have the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. You guys are familiar with this one because early on in the class, you went to the IUCN Red List and you looked up species and you tried to think about what roles they play in the ecosystem and why people might value them. Do you remember that? Way back in February. So that's the IUCN, and they have passed some international regulations on trying to establish international reserves. Then there is I'll move my head here, the CITES law, and that stands for the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. So this is an international law that regulates trade in animal parts, basically. So it says that you cannot trade body parts or entire live animals of species that are endangered. Now, if you watch the news about wildlife conservation, you will see that this law is broken constantly worldwide. It's very hard to enforce. You may remember about 2 years ago, Prince William, when he was still part of the royalty in Britain, destroyed all of the ivory in the collection of the British monarchy. He had it all destroyed. And some people were angry, but because of the loss of art and history. But he said that he needed to make a strong statement because ivory, international trade of ivory, is the primary reason that elephants are going extinct, right? That elephants are endangered. And so why does ivory have a big market? You can't eat it. You don't make it into weapons or a house. It's just only for decorative uses and some medicinal uses, which are not supported by research. So it's just used to make statues and piano keys and other frivolous, in my opinion, items that people use to show status and wealth. And so his idea with destroying the entire supply of ivory in the UK monarchy was to say, this is no longer a display of wealth. I don't value this. I'm taking away the demand, and that's the only thing that will cut the supply. So that's one example of somebody trying to boost the power of CITES. But CITES has a tough battle to fight, right? They're working internationally to stop animal trade. One last thing I want to note on that is that wildlife genetics, conservation genetics, which is my field, is playing a really important role in this because it's essentially like wildlife forensics. So now you can go into a fishmonger's in any country in the world, and you can take samples of the fish and test them, test their genetics, and see where they're actually from. Are they actually from are they the species that the fishmonger said they were? Were they actually fished where the fishmonger said they were? And this is a really, really valuable tool in the fight against the trade of endangered species. Okay, and then down there at the bottom, last but not least, of course, we have state and local protections of endangered species. New York State has an endangered species list that we consider some species state level endangered that aren't listed as endangered on the federal level. So there's a fair amount of legal protections, some of them harder to enforce than others. Okay, but what do we do once we have identified a species as endangered? It's been listed, let's say, by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as an endangered species. So now we are mandated by law to create a recovery plan for that species. So what I want to walk you through today and Friday is how is a recovery plan for these species made? So we'll go through the first couple steps here, and you have done some of these steps, right? And I'll point out which ones as we go through here. With the California condor, you worked on some of these steps. So the first step is gather information. That should always be your first step. And I really want to emphasize this to students. it's not only your first step in making a recovery plan for an endangered species, it should be your first step in all projects. I all too often see students doing a research project who just want to jump straight to what's the question they want to answer and collect data. But without gathering the information that's out there, you don't know what's already known about your question. You don't understand like the nuances of it or what the specific problems are related to it. Always do your research first in the published literature, right? In this case, the way that you gather information is you go out in the field and try and see how many animals are there, or plants, or invertebrates, right? Whatever species you're looking at. So you might get to work with some really charismatic species like this woman down here with the mountain lion, or you might be a marine biologist collecting data there with a coral reef, or like this guy over here setting up mist nets, and those are nets that are used to trap both birds and bats to do population surveys. So like I said up here, you want to diagnose population status. So how many species are out there, and is that number changing year after year? And I put on here, check this out, it says errors are risky. They are risky because if you say an overestimate could cause premature delisting. So if you go out there and you are trapping mountain lions and you have a solid study design and you estimate based on the number you trapped how many you think are actually out there, but you estimate 300 and there's actually only 200, the agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the State Department of Environmental Conservation might decide to delist that species based on that estimate, meaning it no longer has the endangered species status or needs that protection. And as you can imagine, that's a terrible mistake if there's actually only 200 of those mountain lions. By the same token, if you underestimate it, if you underestimate the population size, then you might actually not get the resources you need to actually recover that population. So say there's 200 mountain lions, but you say there's 100. And you get all this funding to do all these recovery efforts, but you were mistaken, there's actually 200. Well, those resources could have gone somewhere else to save another species, right? So this is a delicate task because it's not, if you think about like the US Census, how many people live in America? You just go to door and you ask the people, hey, how many people live here? And you can't do that with wildlife, right? You can't trap one mountain lion and say, hey, how many mountain lions are in this area? How many babies did you have last year? Can't say that. So you have to be out there in the field for many, many hours, trapping and counting and releasing these animals. It's fun though. Fieldwork is the best. Okay. So once you know how many individuals in your species, your target species are out there, then you need to say, okay, if we want to recover them, what are the threats? What are the primary threats? Here we have a recreational snorkeler looking at a manatee in Florida. So if you go and you estimate the population numbers of the manatees and you say, okay, in this one Florida Cay, there's 65 manatees, of which 50 are breeding age adults. Okay, so that's good, solid information. But now what do you need to do to get that population back up to a stable level? Well, we know that threats to manatees include, or potential threats to manatees include loss of the food chain supply, right, from pollution in the water. They also are very commonly injured by boats. You can see this one up here has that white scar above his front leg there. So manatees get really chopped up by boat propellers. So creating a safe, no boating zone where manatees, maybe where they reproduce. This is the part of identifying the threat is really, really important, right? Because that's what you need to fix to get the species into recovery phase. So as you're identifying threats, I just did an example of the manatee, but if you think about overall some reasons for species endangerment that you might imagine, like some top suspects you might investigate, we've already studied quite a few reasons this semester that might spring to your mind. So hopefully what's springing to your mind is, does this species, is it experiencing habitat loss or fragmentation? Is this species being over-harvested or overexploited? Is there an invasive species that's moving into this species' territory? So I put some of those on there. So whatever reason you find is going to require a different recovery plan, right? If the main threat to the species is habitat loss and habitat fragmentation, then primarily what you need to do is protect habitat and restore habitat connections. If the main threat is overharvest, overexploitation, then you need to spend your funds on a control plan to fix the overexploitation. You guys have worked on that in class. You've also worked on invasive species. If the main threat is an invasive species, you've worked on plans for how to deal with invasive species. What about pollution? We haven't actually really dealt with that one much in class, but pollution is a major issue for wildlife, not just because, you know, if you think of like an oil spill, it coats birds' feathers and it can kill them and it's damaging. There's a lot of indirect effects of pollution. So like this terrible picture up here of a dead seabird filled with plastic, and it says a plague of plastic. So many marine animals die from eating plastic in our garbage islands that we have out in the ocean now. And so this is just a terrible affliction for marine wildlife, and that's from pollution, right? From plastic pollution. This pretty gross looking frog down here, the reason that those frogs have those deformities is because there's a parasite that thrives in water that has high phosphate and high nitrate conditions. And those two, if you recognize what phosphate and nitrates are, probably those of you who like gardening do, they're limiting nutrients for plant growth. So plants love phosphate and nitrate. And so farmers put phosphate and nitrate fertilizer on their fields. When they wash off the fields, they get in the water, and this parasite thrives in those conditions. And this parasite also makes tadpoles grow very weird mutated limbs. So that's an indirect effect of the pollution on the frog population, right? It's not actually like making the water too dirty for them to live. It's causing other indirect effects that equally makes them have a low survival probability. So you identify what the threat is, but these are like direct threats, right, to the species. You also have to think about indirect effects to the system. So there's something called an extinction cascade. And I'll just put my face over here over this block for a minute so that I can talk to you about what an extinction cascade is. So there we go. So imagine that you have this food web over here, this nice, pretty cartoon food web. So imagine that in this food web, the butterfly goes extinct. What else might happen in this food web? Is it just the butterfly who's affected? No more butterflies? Well, what species rely on the butterfly? We can imagine that the flowering plants are pollinated by butterflies, right? So if there's a species that's only pollinated by that butterfly, it will go extinct at some point as well. Let's go up to what eats the butterfly. Frogs eat the butterfly, dragonflies eat the butterfly, and that's about it. So if the butterfly goes extinct, will we lose the frogs and the dragonfly? Not right away, because they eat other things too, right? The dragonfly also eats fruit flies, the frog also eats dragonflies and grasshoppers. But it weakens the system, right? They have one less food source. So now if we have another species go extinct, like the fruit fly, or say the grasshopper, because we're using so many pesticides on our corn, then the frog is going to have very little food sources, and combined with other threats, it might go extinct, which then threatens the frog's predators. So I'm not going to go through the whole food web, but you can imagine how this happens. If there's species that are highly reliant on another species and that species goes extinct, the species that depends on it is also going to go extinct. It's like dominoes, right? And that's called an extinction cascade. Okay, so there's also something that can happen just from being a small population. So as you're planning your recovery plan for your endangered species, you need to think about just the threat of just literally actually being a small population, that's a threat in and of itself. And you can imagine why. Forget about pollution or habitat loss or habitat fragmentation, overexploitation. When you have a very small population, random events can wipe out the whole population, right? So random storms or tsunamis. A tsunami situation is pretty unlikely, right? But like, look at, I put in a crazy storm picture for you. Imagine the rest of humanity's on that boat, right? That's not a very good situation because in a huge storm, there's a high potential that all of humanity gets wiped out. Same thing if you imagine that there's a frog population living in one estuary on the coast, and it's just been reduced to this one estuary, and then we drain that estuary to build coastal homes. That's it. That species is gone, right? So the other threat is that if, for example, this happens sometimes with large carnivores, like the Florida panther. So the Florida panther, there's so few Florida panthers left that they had trouble finding mates, even if they were perfectly healthy. Is just such a long distance to other Florida panther territories that they had a really hard time finding mates. Florida panther has actually been recovered. So that's a happy ending story. But so if you're a small group, it's like they say, safety in numbers, right? You face threats just from being a small group. So another threat small populations have is inbreeding, right? So this is like what I call the desert island effect. So we have all these shows on TV like Lost, and I can't think of any others, but Lost, if you ever watched that show, where like a small group of humans, of incredibly beautiful humans, is stranded on a desert island somewhere, and they have to figure out the mysteries of that island and escape or whatever. Okay, there is no possible way for them to build a sustainable society there because their initial breeding pool is too small. So the desert island effect basically means that if you're just a small population, then you're more likely to mate with someone who's related to you over time, right? So that causes inbreeding. And I think you know, even if you're not a biology major, that inbreeding is not good, right? It lets suppressed genes come to the surface and be expressed, and it causes genetic deformities, reduced vigor, less likelihood to reproduce successfully. So I put some examples up here of species that are experiencing this. The golden lion tamarins in Brazil, they just have so little habitat left. Their populations are so small and they're isolated in these little islands of forest. And so they're showing a lot of effects of inbreeding. Same thing with the spruce grouse here in the Adirondacks. If you've ever seen a spruce grouse, lucky you. They're a beautiful bird, and they are pretty threatened in the Adirondacks. Their population got down so small that about 10 years ago, they were having a lot of inbreeding effects, and the New York DEC decided to bring in spruce grouse from Canada to introduce to our populations, to reintroduce vigor to the population. So that's an ongoing project that's being done by Angelina Ross at our DEC. And Glenn Johnson's also worked a lot on that project, and I'm currently working with Angie to try and figure out if the genetic rescue worked, working on that genetic data. Okay, so this last piece here, we're almost done. We're gonna save the rest for Friday. But once you've gathered information about your species, you know how many individuals there are, where they're located, then you know the threats to your species. Now you can develop a plan for the recovery. So now we're getting to kind of the part that you did with the condors on Friday, right? You read an intro about the species, you know what the threats are. The threats are small population, just being a small population, and then the poisoning, right? From eating poisoned cattle. So how are you gonna recover them? So a lot of times with your recovery, you have to be able to say, since you're using a law to ask for money to protect this species, you have to be able to say, what number will we be done at? What's our goal? You can't just say, let's help this species, it's the right thing to do. You need to say, what is the minimum viable population of this species? What is the smallest number at which we can say they will be able to maintain a population without human assistance? So that's something you worked on in your Condor lab, right? You adjusted the population going in to see how high it had to be to stop that growth line from going to 0, right? You need to identify in your recovery goals what habitat is reasonable to protect, and what trends you want to see. Like, do you want to see a certain percentage growth every year? Do you want to see a certain number of breeding adults every year? You need to identify the indicators, because like any good plan, you need specific quantitative goals so you can see if you've reached them. So minimum viable population is a word that if you go into ecology or biology, you'll hear that term a lot. It's hard to estimate sometimes. It represents the minimum number of individuals necessary to maintain a healthy population of the target species. That can be really hard to estimate, right? You have to know something about the genetic diversity in that population to know how big it needs to be to avoid that. Again, you kind of worked on this with your Condor lab because you were trying to see like how many breeding adults and non-breeding juveniles were needed to make that population growth curve not go to 0. You didn't look at inbreeding or genetic diversity in that, but that's another metric that can be considered. Okay. So sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Oh, so when you're writing your recovery, when you're identifying your recovery goals, you have to also consider that you should be doing this in an adaptive management framework. What does that mean? In a nutshell, it means just because you said you were going to do something one way and it's clearly not working, you don't have to keep doing it that way. So say you're managing for the California condor and you decided we don't need to do the captive breeding program as long as we just get X number of acres in poison control, because my model showed that. Okay, then you did number 1, you conceptualized the idea, and you did number 2, you developed a modeling plan, and you looked at basically how's it going to affect, I have my model, my quantitative model, and I'm saying how is it going to affect the condors if we don't release any new ones, but we get more area and poison control. But then when you start implementing that, some other problem comes up. Like, yeah, the farmers aren't putting out poisoned cows, but a lot of condors are getting hit by cars as they feed on carcasses on the highway. Okay, so now you're at number 4. You have to analyze, use, and adapt that new information. So your plan made sense, you implemented it, but it's not working because something out there changed. So you analyze, use, and adapt that. Then you capture and share your learning. So collect data on how many condors are being hit by a car, right? And then you're back at the next step. So let's adapt our management. Adaptive management is used by almost every conservation agency in the world because, I mean, it's kind of obvious reasons, right? You can't have a management plan that doesn't change when circumstances change. It also means you can't just get your population of your endangered species back up to the minimum viable population, then walk away, right? You have to keep monitoring it on a lower level to see if other threats are coming up. Okay, so that's all for today. There's 2 more steps on here. Like it says, so there's a step missing there, but we'll finish those last 2 steps on Friday. So implementing the recovery objectives and then monitoring the species. We'll look at those on Friday, and I have a cool video to share with you on Friday. But usually we do your workshop with the condor fit better in last week because of the schedule, but it kind of tied together all the information from the extinction lectures and the endangered species management lectures this week. So as you're listening to these lectures, just think about what you learned from doing that exercise and how that, what perspective that gives you on if you were going to make a recovery plan for a species in reality. Okay, so thank you for sticking with me through this. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and I will see you on Friday.